In this video, we will see the process for defining a ledger and FQA structure. We will look at the business triggers for the process, the data involved. We will look at the process in the ideas screens, the output of the process, processes that depend on it, and exceptions to this process. Starting with the business triggers, we need to run this process usually when we are doing an ideas implementation. This is the first step in configuration. So before anything else can be done, we need to define the ledger and determine the FQA structure for that ledger. Another case might be when we need to record data in an FQA that's different from the one we had determined for the ledger. So if we are, say, implementing ideas, the first thing we would do is set up the ledger for accounting purposes, and usually we will call it the GL ledger, and that might have a structure of elements for coding transactions that is different from what we may need for other purposes. So say, for example, for tracking volumes for some companies that operate in Mexico that need to track volumes in a way that is requested or required by Pemex, we can set up a different ledger to the GL ledger and have other elements, say, for that. So we can have, say, by well, by field, something of that sort that might be needed and might not be the same as we have in the GL ledger for tracking volumes. Another case of this is the JIB ledger, and that's a fairly common ledger in oil and gas companies. And the JIB ledger will keep the gross and net for partners instead of for the entities for which we keep the accounting, day-to-day accounting and ideas. So the partners' gross and net is kept in that JIB ledger. So to summarize, we have usually these two scenarios where ledgers are needed to be set up. At first, when we're just implementing the software ideas, and then also in the case where we want to track in ideas something, some data that's not exactly accounting data. So if we need to keep data, let's say for volumes, and we want to use a different coding structure than the one we have defined for the GL ledger, we can do that by creating an additional ledger. For the data, we have no master data yet or transactional data. So usually when we define the ledger, this is the first step for configuring the idea system. So all we need to know is actually what we want to call the ledger we're going to create. And the FQA elements, fully qualified account elements, we are going to use in transaction coding. So whenever we do a transaction, we may want to track that transaction by different concepts or dimensions. And usually we'll find things such as the entity or company code, the AFE code, the account code, cost centers, project IDs, things of that sort that we want to use to tag transactions so that then we can book them to the general ledger, and then we can run reports on that, financial reports, management reports, and other. The process is basically as follows. So first we need to access the general ledger module. Then we have to go to the ledger definition screen. We will provide the ledger ID. We will then create the FQA element names or types. So entity, account, AFE, and so on. Then we need to tell the system which is going to be the entity element and the description element for the ledger. We will define the number of periods to partition the ledger in. Usually it's 13 periods, 12 for each month. So one for each month, and then a 13th period for adjustments. We then need to determine the balance sheet account types, and that's what's going to give us what's going to tell the system what accounts to not zero out in the year-end roll process. or the year-end close process. Then we will select the elements and the order in which we're going to use those elements when we start coding transactions. That's the FQA string, or fully qualified string. And then we'll provide the abbreviations that are going to show up in different screens and ideas when we code those transactions. And we do that in the account ID format screen, where we also determine certain edit rules for those elements. And if we want to use more fields in the element maintenance screen, which is where actual elements are created, say actual accounts or entity codes or cost centers and AFEs, we can basically tell the system if we want to use more fields in that screen for each element. So let's look at the process in the idea system. The first step in the process, we need to go to Customizer in the General Ledger module, and then go to Ledger Definitions, or Ledger Definition. Here we'll type in the ledger ID we're going to use. Let's say it's the GL ledger. And now we're going to start to create the element types or element names. So say, for example, we're going to create here the entity element. We're going to say it's going to have the E prefix and 4 characters in length. So what this means is internally the system is going to tag an E to identify that this is the entity element. So that's behind the scenes in the database. And the element length means that the detail elements, which are the ones where transactions are coded to, have to have 4 characters. After we do that, we can create the next element. Let's say we're going to create the AFE element, or actually let's do an account element. Prefix is going to be A, and then the element length is going to be 7 characters. So 7 characters are the ones that need to be entered when we're coding transactions to an account. If not, well, the account is not valid. Then we can enter, say, the AFE element. It's going to be, we can say, 7 characters. It could be another number. This is just an example. Cost center. Let's see, 5 characters to that. Let's do typically, so we have entity, account, AFE, cost center. You might have a separate element for departments, although sometimes people use a cost center for this as well. Let's say we have 3 or 4 there. And another case, say for Canadian companies, we might have production month. So let's say this is the P element. It has 4 characters. Oil and gas companies will most probably use the bill code element to determine transactions that are billable to partners or recoverable from the government, or both. Let's say this is B. And let's do 4 characters or 3 characters. In some countries, you may need to keep a statutory chart of accounts, so we can create another one, call it the local account. Or some companies like to use the sub account, so we can use an element for both the local account that also is the sub account, so we can call it, say, sub local, and use S for that. And let's say it's 5 characters. And say that that's the elements we're going to use. So what we'll do next is select the account as the description element. And for accounting ledgers, that's usually the case. And then the entity element, it's usually the entity. And then for periods, we'll have 13. This usually needs to be checked, basically so that the journal line items entities matches the header for that journal. We then set the account types that are not going to be zeroed out by the year-end roll process. So in this case, we have assets, so type A, liabilities, type L, owner's equity, type O, JIB, type S, so JIB balance sheet, type S accounts, and statistics accounts. So the other accounts will be zeroed out, say, and are going to affect the retained earnings calculation. this can be clarified in a separate video for the year-end role process, but these are the accounts that the ones that are checked will not be zeroed out by the year-end role process for the segment, and segments will be seen also in a different video. Once we have done that, we can go ahead and create or determine the order for the FQA string, for the fully qualified account string, or the coding string for transactions. So in this case, first we will have the users enter the entity element. Then we can do the account that is fairly common, but some people of late have also determined they want to see the AFE first, and then have the system, depending on cross-referencing, which is another process, filter so that we can only see the accounts that are cross-referenced to the AFE that is selected. We might then have, let's say, the cost center, department, sub-account or local account, production month, and bill code, for example. So in this case, we have an 8-element FQA. However, we could have up to 10 elements in the FQA. The maximum amount is 10, and also the maximum length for the FQA, including the delimiters, which are the dashes between the elements when transactions are coded. The maximum must be 60 characters. So after we have that, we can now save, and we have now determined that our ledger is going to be called GL, and the structure we need to use for coding transactions is entity followed by FE, then account, cost center, department, sub or local account, production month, and bill code. Once we have done that, we can go ahead and determine the edit rules for the elements. Now we can go to the account ID format. And in the account ID format, all we're going to do is determine a few edit rules and then the summarized form or abbreviation for the elements. So usually for entity, we'll do this. For account, we'll do this. And I'll explain what this is for in a moment. For FE, we'll do this. For account, we'll do this. And the other elements, we can do this. And what that means is when we're entering the entity element, for example, the user needs to provide all characters of the entity element. The user must do it, so they can't skip the element. So that's why it's required. And A means that we can define elements to be alphanumeric, while N means they must be numeric. So in this case, all elements can be alphanumeric, which gives us more options for element definitions. In this case, say for AFE, we're using ROA. This means that we're going to do right fill. So when the user enters a character in the field and they move on to the next field, the system is going to zero fill to the right. So if I enter, say, number 1 in the field and then tab out, the system will fill in the other characters with zeros. O means that it's an optional field, so if I skip it, the system will zero fill it. I don't need to type anything in it. If it's R, it means that I have to type something, otherwise I can't continue. So after I do that, I can go to print format and I can select the abbreviations for the headings in different screens where the system is going to ask for the FQA. So we're going to do, say, ENT for entity, we can do AFE here, ACCT here, CC for cost center, DEPT for department, sub for sub-account, or sub-L, sub-account, local account, B month for production month, and BC for bill code. And these headings cannot exceed the length that we have defined here. Finally, after we do that, we can go ahead and determine in this element definition screen if we want to have additional fields for the elements. So for example, for the account, 2 fields are already defined. I can have a third one. We can have, say, for AFE, we can ask for, say, type of AFE and make it required and say that it's going to be string, for example. And then what that means is when we start to create elements over here, we have to provide those fields. And that's basically the process in the idea screens. The output then is a ledger ID and FQA structure. And from that point on, we can start to configure elements. And then once we have journals, we can start coding transactions. So basically, after we do this, actually, the next step, if we continue, say, a checklist for configuration, is to create calendars for the ledger. We can then create segments for that ledger, so financial segments for keeping, say, our financial books in different currencies. And also we can create the accumulation files for the ledger, which are the tables in the database where the journal data that is posted is kept. So those are the dependencies. In terms of exceptions, there are none. Thanks for viewing this video guide on defining the ledger and FQA structure.